Hello and welcome to the PGR Podcast, presented by Danny Dunn and Katrine Japanova. In today's episode, we'll deep dive into the heartbeat of urban design as we have the pleasure of speaking to the esteemed academic, architect, urban designer, musician, and associate professor in urban design at the Bartlett School of Planning, Dr. Filipa Matos Wunderlich. We'll start with Dr. Wunderlich's journey towards her latest book, Temporal Urban Design, Temporality, Rhythm and Place, talk about the story of her incredible professional journey, and finish off on a lighter personal note.
Now, to set the stage for our guest, Dr. Wunderlich has been a leading voice in the study of urban spaces for almost 2 decades now, contributing to groundbreaking interdisciplinary research and practical insights. Her latest book, Temporal Urban Design, Temporality, Rhythm and Place, gives unique perspectives into the patterns of city life and how to understand and design for them, approaching urban places as symphonies of events, pulsating with the rhythms of time. Undoubtedly inspired by her career as a musician and prominent since her earliest publications, the concepts of place rhythms, time space in urban design, and the essential role that public spaces play in shaping and being shaped by urban activities are present all throughout Dr. Wunderlich's career. Welcome, Dr. Wunderlich. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Right out of the gate, we must ask, how long has your latest book been in the making, and what initially drew you towards the concept of the temporality of urban places?
Thank you. The plan to write a book on the topic of urban sense of time, place, temporality, and rhythm arose almost 10 years ago. Now, however, this initial draft of topic, which had mostly then an analytical perspective on places, has evolved and matured and crystallized in this more recent version, which I've called of Temporal Urban Design. And this book embeds methodological innovation, as I see it, or an appeal for it in terms of what is rhythm analysis of places. Yet for me, and most importantly, it emphasizes on the time-space dimension and the aesthetics, the temporal aesthetics of the urban environment and urban places. So I look at the temporal, the rhythmic, the performative attributes that one ought to design for. So it contextualizes this dimension and responds to some of what I also open up the book with, which I think was one of the most the most important challenges we're faced in cities today, which are overdevelopment, estranged behaviors, and the mental health crisis. So this agenda responds to these 3 sort of challenges, but also beyond other challenges that we were, in fact, of interdisciplinary nature that urban designers and planners haven't been exposed to and indeed challenged with. And as I said, it looks at sort of the aesthetics, of urban places from a temporal point of view, and then tries and bring methods of approach, methodological practices of how to approach that. But then it ends the book with sort of also principles for practice, which is something I'm currently further developing upon.
Right. I feel like that was very valuable, that you start from such a philosophical beginning of how do you measure time, how do you measure space and time together, and then it just reaches this practical up to this practical method that you can actually use. I feel like that's essentially what research is about. You take a concept and you develop it. And this kind of feeds into our next question, which is, you talk in your book about how our daily interactions with the urban environment are shaped by it, and we also shape it. But you mentioned that certain overwhelming environments can negatively impact mental health. And you just touched on it again. Can you elaborate on this and share any other examples of how urban spaces can affect psychological well-being? I feel like that's very, very relevant today.
It is indeed, and I think there's a growing interest and certainly growth in research outputs. Many colleagues busy with this topic, including myself. So I think in terms of your question, to respond to your question, I think there's a range of physical and social and experiential factors which affect our mental well-being, and overall, we are supported by. This statement is supported by recent findings in environmental psychology, in neuropsychology and psychiatry, which are looking at the urban environment, and they are showing us how fast, complex, and dense urban environments indeed contribute to the rise of mental health problems, and these include not only stress, low moods, but things like anxiety, depression, and even psychotic and delusional and schizophrenic conditions, if we wanted to go even more further into the field. So I do refer to there's a bit in my book that refers specifically to some of this, but just to summarize, for example, I in terms of how I mentioned how architectural complexity and the eclectic mixing can induce overwhelming states of confusion and disorientation. I also mentioned how social factors such as crowdness, displacement, isolation can contribute to high levels of urban stress. But then with these levels of urban stress or raised levels of urban stress come distorted senses of time. So people think about and sense time differently when they are under stress and under an anxiety state. And obviously this then having a longer term impact on lingering states of anxiety and depression of urbanites in a sense. And finally, I also sort of refer to more sensorial and experiential factors, such as, for example, the sense or experiences of extreme acceleration and speed in particular locations, which makes us often feel overpowered in public spaces. So what can I do? I just have to follow on and behave and move and as others do. Now, then, I think in my book, I try at least explore this association between senses of time and pace and speed, and then present also how these are associated to either positive or negative emotions and states of mind. So, and in a sense, that's kind of where it all started for me. I was curious about that. What makes what are the differences between fast places and slow places, and why are fast places linked with senses of stress, agitation, confusion? This is the most that people will refer to, and what came out of interviews at the initial stage of the research. And also then slow places being associated with being calm or rhythmic and harmonic and balanced. It's not always like this, black or white, but on the most that's what what people responded. So there is this association between pace, complexity, acceleration, and states of mind and emotional, and then then that will have an impact whether or not you're going to come back to those places, unless you're forced to, and it's part of your everyday life, and in which case you will most likely enter in this kind of automatic sort of lingering state of being stressed and anxious in the urban environment, because you have to. And I mean, what I've said is like I said at the start, it's supported by by medical research. So there's nothing. So what I've done is to look at what they're saying, or indeed sort of try and, okay, as I realize this is what there's a relationship between, there's a certain type of aesthetics related to speed and acceleration of place. So what is the medical profession saying? And indeed, I found this direct relationship between distorted senses of time and mental health conditions. One popular book or which you might be interested to look at is Adli Mazda. In 2017, he writes his book on stress in the city. I recommend if you want to dig more into it, and he discusses kind of stress related risks in cities, and he speaks about some of these factors I've mentioned.
Yeah, I feel that's very almost eye-opening, because to some degree, I feel like everyone can sense this feeling of stress, of anxiousness, of constant rush, especially in the big cities, especially around commute times as well. Peak times are really, really something. But it's really interesting that you've put it down to, it's about the space, it's about the time, it's about the pace. It's actually about those things. It's not an inner human thing. It's not natural to us. It's not human to us to go into these states one after the other. And it's very interesting because in your book you delve into very intricate concepts. You go into describing a very interesting concept, discovery in physics, which is the chronon, as a very basic unit of time. And I wanted to ask, can you share an example of an event, or I don't know, some sort of happening in the urban space that can be comparable to such unit of time, let's say, the way the chronon works for physics? So in the urban sense of spaces, I guess, would that be like the step, or I don't know, the approach?
Yeah. So what I can think of is, for example, the walking rhythm. It's a very essential one, and very basic in a sense. This is a pattern that greatly varies in terms of its frequency, in terms of patterns of duration, of its intensity over the day, or even over, if it's a week or a weekend. And it can really strikingly help us to read senses of pace and speed in places, and how it varies, even subject to, for example, weather conditions or seasons. So the walking rhythm is one which is quite evidently helps you to understand how does this place feel, how does it sound, if you enter a place in when people are all moving fast at a very fast pace, or the same place, and you come back to it, and you enter that place in the rush hour, or you enter that place in the rest hour, say from 10 to 11 in the morning, or at 3 o'clock in the middle of the afternoon, you will be nudged or kind of induced to join in at very different places. Yes, so it's the rush hour. You kind of enter this space. It's loud. There's the tapping. There's the soundscape of the walking, the regular tapping, the fast tapping of the sort of heels, and you kind of feel like I have to move fast as well. I can't just stay on. I'm interrupting. Right, I'm disrupting, while it totally changes if you enter that same space at a different time. But then also, the rhythm of social practices tell you a lot of how who this place belongs to, who is it for, how it how it works, and of course the pace and the duration of these social practices, and I mean people meeting either together in bigger groups or in smaller groups, does induce a faster or a calmer sense of rhythm in situ as well. But what's most striking and really interesting about the rhythm of social practices is that it tells you a lot. They engrave and present the actual narratives of the space itself. So they tell you about what they represent the unique stories of what the place is about. In the way they are practiced, by whom, for what they do. So they kind of it's the play itself. It's that urban design that I'm referring to. The design, the performance, which shapes stories, and the stories have meaning, and the meaning is then attributed to the place and the space you're looking at. If that makes sense.
That's very sensible, especially when you describe your method. I almost feel like it could be on the way to unlock this very key problem in urban design, which comes up all the time. It's all about identity and defining what identity of a place is, and how do you measure it, how do you define it, how do you protect it, how do you enhance it. And do you feel like rhythm analysis is actually like maybe a small step towards this? It somewhat feels this way to me.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think I feel the same. So I think in a way character goes way beyond the physicality of a space, and that's maybe why for so many decades it's still a notion that urban designers are still elaborating on. What do we mean by character? What do we mean by authenticity? What do we mean by, I think for me was that handicap of being sort of almost like obsessed by one dimension, which is the space dimension, the physical dimension, when actually all these notions refer to a totally different dimension, which is people and space together, and the narration of what they do, and the co-production of the space as it unfolds, and being able to tell their story through rhythm analysis, and use rhythm analysis as a method to tell that story is for me the objective and the most important thing.
Yes, that's it. It is, in fact, as you say, one space could become a totally different space depending on the time of day you attended. And now we're just going to go a little more deeper into your methodology. And just for context, in her book, Dr. Wunderlich goes into exploring this method of actually capturing the rhythms of the city. And this is called rhythm analysis, as we've been referring to it. And the place or the field where she performs this is at Fitzroy Square in London, which is nested around very, very public and large spaces. It has two big stations around, like Euston and King's Cross, and it's a generally interestingly nested, calmer space within a very dynamic let's say, district of London. And from this, then Dr. Wunderlich goes on to create this wonderful spectrograms which measure how many events happen, for how long they happen, and it's very, very interesting and lovely. You also capture the motion of some people. I found this very interesting, capturing the dynamics of motion through these stroboscopic images, which show one image maybe showing within the intervals a couple of seconds of movement. So from this point of view, you highlight that the rhythm analyst, which is the person who would perform this fieldwork, is crucial to understanding and designing vibrant places. In your professional opinion, what do you think is the current biggest obstacle or challenge to introducing rhythm analysis into urban design? Because it's a very, very novel and wonderful method, but I also feel like anything wonderful and novel is so difficult to put into these rigid systems.
Yes, I mean, this is a great question, and it's a question which I'm certainly going forward to explore, and there are real challenges there. I think, and that reminds me an interesting project I've recently did with bringing practitioners and performers together in one room to discuss that same question. So how do we bring it over to practice?
That sounds so interesting.
I'm working on sort of bringing this forward in a research paper. But that engagement was really enlightening. Whilst they were really excited about the topic and could no doubt agree this is something I'd like to be engaged with, the topic of rhythm, the topic of the sense of time is terribly important for my practice, and recognizing this and mapping this in public space is very, very important. So how do we? They've identified, a list of challenges they would have in their practice, and we went about to discuss some ways forward. So it was a small initial study into that area that I carried on some time ago, but certainly this is just to illustrate that is an area that, of course, needs exploration and work, and it's not out of my mind. I mean, what I could say is that place rhythm analysis is useful more broadly, not only to urban designers, but more generally to urban analysts to understand places and their state of what I call temporal and rhythmic co-production between nature, people, and the architecture of the spaces themselves. But urban design has a lot to benefit, from my perspective, from integrating this practice as a methodological practice in their process of analysis and design. Particularly as those urban designers, and I think urban design in their pursuit of the design for vivid and meaningful temporal atmospheres and temporal landscapes, and as we also search to steer pride and engagement, regular community interactions. If this is what is a shared value and a shared ambition of urban design, then place rhythm analysis as a method to support responses to that is in my view absolutely essential and has great potential to it. Now, and as I introduced, I think for this to happen, urban design and place and the planning industry, that there is work to be done, and I think the urban designers and urban design needs to more emphatically review and set its focus on what I call the ecological and the social sustainability of cities. Needs much more to be brought forward into debates and the conscience of the urban designer, but also not just of the stakeholders they work with. So the urban designer is the carrier of that message and that value so work needs to be done at that level, how to promote these values of doing, so that we in this closer relationship with the client, but also other stakeholders. But then there's also politics and research, which need to support the industry in this endeavor. And as part of this, I think we are already experiencing or seeing a turn, at least in some European cities, which are going forward and pioneering different foundational economic models. And here, I'm not sure you're aware, but but one of them I actually speak about in the book, in the first first chapter, with the donut economy, for example,
Right.
which is being tried and practiced in the city of Amsterdam. And it's a different way of looking at the micro-social environment and economic sustainability by instead focusing on promoting social productivity, social capital, and health in the city as a way to achieve long-term economic success. So this is a way of thinking which of course requires it to be sort of first of all accepted, valid by the politicians and those which drive and frame, of course, then planning and design agendas in cities and countries. So it's a complex area, but to me, no doubt, I think can be dissected, scrutinized, and achieved. But it does require a certain change and certain alternative view and perspective onto cities and why they're important and what matters. Also economically. So
Yeah, that's definitely the case.
And it appears as though, I think, at least previous centuries worth of design and planning has kind of led to this sort of function-led urban design. And actually what we've just talked about here, from the psychological, ecological, and I guess the pairing of that to make a better economic future, it feels as if we're kind of viewing our cities, or previously we're viewing it from very functional based view, but now actually we kind of need to consider them as our habitat as a species.
Absolutely.
And I feel that's like a big piece that's been missing.
Yes.
And you were just talking, I think, in our first question about places that feel either psychologically distressing or maybe soothing or calming. Are there any particular places that you feel, and particularly for those that maybe haven't read your book, but are there any places that you feel are particularly symbolic of these two, either highly stressful places or sort of calming places, and what can we learn from these examples if you have them?
I think I mean in the research as I mentioned, in the research I've pursued in the initial stages, I was really curious about those really strikingly different places related to sensitive place. I mean, one of the spaces I looked at was, for example, Piccadilly Circus in London, as opposed to Regent's Park, which is the most striking examples of where different emotional senses of emotional states, but also senses of pace. But you could also look at King's Cross or Fitzroy Square. They're not far apart, but or Fitzroy Square and Euston Road, which are just one street apart of each other. I think what's really striking is that, in particularly in cosmopolitan environments like London, perhaps like Glasgow, like more sort of complex, bigger cities, we are seeing more and more sort of these really intense patchworks of distorted sense of time very quickly. So you moved from Regent's Park into Euston Road, and suddenly it's a completely different world. You're stricken by levels of stress, but you don't know why. But actually, the environment is different. The speed is incredibly apart. And it's this kind of schizophrenia of patchworks of multiple patchworks of different senses of time and places beside each other that kind of make our experiences of city quite disjointed sometimes.
I feel like that's why your method is so valuable, because it's almost like urban design has the tendency to look things from above and kind of prescribe this is why it is this way, because people use it in such a way. But then your method is so valuable because it actually looks at the truth, the way the space actually does exist, the way it truly is used. And in a way, I personally feel that could be one of the biggest challenges to urban design that such a novel method would pose. It wouldn't necessarily be integrating it as much as it would be challenging a bit the status quo of what was maybe thought first of these spaces, because you're quite right, they're not very far apart. For example, Fitzroy Square or King's Cross on Euston Road, and you would assume this area is so busy and nauseous, but then you can find these pockets of still
And actually,
time.
each of them on its own right is a completely different world, and in a completely different assemblage of the kind of people, the kind of social practices, the kind of movements, the speed of movements. They are so starkly different, and to look at cities in just from a functional perspective, or just from in a generalized way, and apply standard methods of looking at places. It's not, it's not really the way forward to discover their intricacy and be able to more more truthfully, in a sense, more sensitively respond to what the spaces and places actually need and the cities actually need.
Right.
And you could extend that this debate to different scales as well. So you have London, but then you have smaller cities like I'm thinking of Delft, and I always think of places where I've lived, because that gives me a very a very real sense of, I know the places, so they're very, or the city of Rotterdam, the city of Delft, they're very, very different environments. So you could scale this up or down as you wish, but the debate is similar.
Next question follows into that sort of logic of, we want to design calmer spaces, we want them to be nicer, we want them to be these lovely pockets of diversity and calmness. And in that sort of thinking, we wanted to ask, what symbols or spatial codes do you prescribe? You said there's common features among those slow spaces. Do you have somewhat of a, I don't know, not a manual, but maybe a prescription, let's say?
Yeah. Well, temporal urban design is less about promoting visual or spatial codes, but more about developing social and spatial collaborative modes of production. So for example, through and that's something I touch upon at the tail of the book, I think, in the last chapter. So for example, through tactile interventionism design, but also through crafts and craftsmanship in the city, which can rhythmically and collectively instill long-term senses of connectivity, engagement, pride in the spaces you produce together. So spaces we use, but spaces we love, and we'll love more if, and we'll stop more, and we will slow down if we are engaged in delivering them or designing them. So these sort of new modes of urban social spatial production, which I talk about, shall hopefully and the idea is that they slow us down, that they promote collective and a more human and regular and rhythmic modes of interaction for a common good. So that's when then and so, for example, more specifically, when I talk about urban tactical interventionism as a powerful tool in the practice of temporal urban design, interventions can be architectural, spatial, physical, can be prompts in the public space, but they can also be sensorial and performative. So it widens up the scope of what design is and what and challenges what we thought it has been so far, and extends it into these modes of doing. And key here is to try and understand how to redirect existing and generate new kinds of place rhythms by doing those kind of tactical interventions of different kinds. And then obviously with that we can add and we can respond to either slowing down or speeding up experiences of urban time. And by no means in my book I'm saying we should only have slow spaces. I think
Yes.
but I think that that's not my perspective. I think a healthy city has those contrasting adds. You know, it's an assemblage of different experiences of speed and of place and of other kinds. I think, for example, and coming back to what tactical intervention can look like, they could be prompts in the public space to disrupt, to modify, to enhance rhythms of places. And they could be art installations, performances, any type of initiative that challenges sort of status quo or norms of behavior that through place rhythm analysis we've identified as being something pertinent to respond to. And then moving on to the area of urban craft and craftsmanship, for example. It's all about, as I mentioned, the collective craftsmanship of the city, so co-producing it together, and that is about, here the focus is about how to design for those places of rhythmic co-production to sort of engender or embed common temporal experiences of the city that then we will remember and we will enjoy to come back to because we've done it together, because we've contributed. And that can be and these are mostly principles, sort of areas of, you know, our areas from within which we can then come up with different responses and solutions. But for example, it can be about everyday community street projects and practices. It can be about community art project, you know, mural painting, coloring, street crossings, which are things, flower carpets, you know, like, you know, there are things that are already happen scattered and have always happened through history, and that we somewhat valued, but we're missing more and more. They are sort of diffusing and erasing out of the space of the city. You know, obviously with the whole as an effect of that, the sort of modernist movement, but also the genization of cities, the beautification, but the generic beautification of cities that is a movement that just invaded us through the 90s, right? And now we have that now we're missing them, and when we see them, we realize how important they are. But it could also be, you know, practices of co-designing, voluntary projects such as, you know, time banks, giving your own time in exchange of something else, or there's an interesting sort of cooperative communal labor work in the production of, for example, community spaces. There's an interesting, very interesting project in Rotterdam, which is evolved in the last it's probably now 6 years old. I'm going back with my students now in February to visit again, which basically is all about the production of a community space by people giving their own time and contributing with the goods and resources they needed, and now evolved into a really interesting, and that means craft time, for example, food, around food making, around gardening, around tailoring, around music making, and all of that generates income, but also it generates value to the community. So it's engrossed into a different way of thinking about economics, in a sense, and it's very, very successful. It's a really interesting model. So I extended a bit into that particular project, but that sort of fits into that idea of the city craftsmanship as being a sort of a social place rhythm of co-production, bringing people together around carefully and detailed and methodical and systematic activities and practices that add to sort of that bonding experiences of time as you do it, and rhythm as you do it as well.
That's very interesting that you mentioned there are lots of projects like that on the rise. But now that you said, because you said it's not essentially an architectural stimuli that creates this change, it could be just organizing yourself as a community around something. I don't know if you've heard recently this concept of the school bus, or what was it? The school cycle bus emerged, where essentially to not create these huge lines of cars of parents dropping off their children. Some schools in the UK, but also some in America, they organize. Have you seen it? It's so lovely.
That's actually in the neighborhood I used to live in. They had this cycle to school.
Yes,
where
where
stop the
essentially
roads and they'd get all of the
all of the
to-
children go together on a bike to the school, and you have like one leading teacher that gathers them all, and they just arrive all at the same time. It really just takes perhaps 15 minutes of commute to get there, but you can really see how much it changes everything, including the neighborhood. Everyone is you can see on the cameras.
They will stop to look, and the children have a different experience of pace and speed every morning. And the whole rhythmic assemblage and it almost kind of refreshes it and changes the way places work and are looked at. They are more liked, they're more enjoyed, and people will come back to see. So there's a dynamic there that challenged perhaps what the place was rhythmically before. So that's a really interesting example about a community initiative that actually physically, means a lot, and potentially will mean that they might start designing the street differently, or start, laying out in the near future, potentially.
And I saw another example of this sort of co-production of space.
Yeah.
And in a couple of papers I've read, they talk about sort of collective gardening projects and sort of the transformation or community transformation of neighborhoods to be a process that can really almost tackle crime, and particularly youth crime and sort of petty acts of arson and vandalism. And then I saw another paper that was studying two different neighborhoods in Mexico, where they were doing a very similar thing, where they're converting spaces that were maybe previously unused and potentially gave off the perception of being unsafe into community gardens and community areas, as a sense not just to draw away from the sort of the threat of the space, but also empower communities to really sort of capture and take strides into making their home not just buildings but places as well, to really embody or embed meaning. I find these two fascinating examples. I
think the key here, not to lose sight, is this kind of instilling regular practice and the rhythmic co-production in a collective project. That it's you have to go back to it. You have to offer your skills, and in that process, in that rhythmic process of production, you will develop a collective temporal experience, but also you will be delivering something you associate meaning with, and that will steer civic pride. It will steer that can then, as you say, have an impact on solving crime or antisocial, because it's a cared for environment. It's not, if that makes sense. So
Yes. It definitely encourages ownership. It just says it's your place as well, which is very nice. Right, to move on to our next question, which comes down again, delving a bit at Fitzroy Square again.
yes.
So seeing at Fitzroy Square, the way it is positioned, the way it's developed, it has the infrastructure laid out, it has very well established old, you talk about Victorian Georgian housing. It's a very complete place in a sense. And I was wondering, how do you envision rhythm analysis working for a space that is, let's say, in transition or is currently being developed as a place? How do you see it working in tandem with that sort of development?
Yeah. In the same way.
Okay. That's interesting.
So this would be an opportunity to discover the incongruence or the incompatibility of its rhythms. Because I think place rhythm analysis is an exercise of temporal discovery and mapping those rhythmic events, the periods of intensity and more or less, and also the dominant or mapping any dominant patterns of disruption or of surprise or patterns. What Angel Lefebvre referred to arrhythmia, but choreographers and dance, they know that, cardiologists know that term too. The arrhythmia of places, which is when things happen but they don't actually make sense. So how do users fit together? Perhaps they don't. Perhaps there's a sort of an in-between space that no one really can describe fully, because there isn't a kind of a regular soundscape or regular patterns of movement, and potentially we might actually get to the opposite conclusion, that actually there is something there that is continuums, and that makes that space special. And unique. It was just difficult to describe it because it wasn't in your radar, and you weren't a regular user. You weren't, and maybe they aren't that regular visitors and passers-by, in order to be able to acquire descriptions from others of what the place is about. But once you're there and you start exploring it more intricately, temporally, you might actually come up with an incredible temporal image of what the place is about. It's rhythmicity, patterns, and
that's very appealing approach to urban design. To be fair, it's almost like treating it the way sculpture is treated, the way sculpture is. I think they always say, "Oh, I make it as it wants to be." So they leave the stone, tell them what the shape should be. It almost feels that way. Leave the space, tell you what it needs to be.
I think place rhythm analysis is all about that, really. It's about the rhythm analyst coming in with a complete open mind of what it's going to find, and start bit by bit choosing where, from which perspective am I going to focus in the square, and from this perspective which rhythm am I going to focus today, tomorrow, and sort of laying it out on top of each other as if I don't know this space, and I'm going sort of to map it as over time.
I see. That's in this line of thinking. Did you find throughout your studies rhythm analysis, and obviously you said this book has been in the making for what is almost 10 years, and it's been, I know from your earlier works, you've also done things about walking, so you've had the perspective of observing the city from that sort of view, that analytical approach. Was there ever a rhythm analysis or a rhythm in specific that you found very surprising? Because it almost feels like most rhythms are very common, they're repetitive and such, but despite their repetitiveness, was there one that was very surprising for you to discover, that people were actually behaving this way continuously?
I think we enter places as urban designers, or sort of the way we've been educated, thinking that they all work similarly, right? That there's some sort of basic elements here, and we wouldn't even need to visit them, because how many urban designers actually design for space that they don't actually go, or if they go for a 15 minutes, a 10 minutes visit, and assume I know everything about it now because I've seen it before or I heard it before. I think temporal urban design really challenges that idea, and I think every place has, no doubt, I have been studying. There was always surprises. There were always really revelations as part of being there. Mindfully and thinking about regularity, thinking about disruption, thinking about surprise, and mapping patterns of intensity, so I think in terms of Fitzroy Square, to give examples perhaps, strikingly were occurrences of and sounds of nature. Fitzroy Square, it's a typical Georgian square with a garden in the middle. Trees of more than 100 years old. I think, and for me, is how the sounds of nature and occurrences of nature, being able, the sounds of the leaves, the falling of the leaves, the change of shade and sunshine into the square, that influenced by the way they went through the trees and the elements of nature, really strong characterized that square, really colored it for me. So it and the way these changes and these patterns and rhythms influence where people would regularly choose to sit, and in fact, all the social practices where they happen, where people decided to meet, to sit, to eat, there was always sort of a relationship. And every time there was a change, say there's rain, or there's no sunshine, or there's or if you enter a space at a particular time of the day, say from the rest hour, the striking sound of birds was incredibly strong, and it had a very strong impact on me, and I think others that were experiencing really chaotic, complex environments. Tottenham Court Road, Euston Road, it couldn't have been more intense. And then you enter that space and you hear a bird singing, or you see. Another one was, and the interesting thing, I mean, I went back to that space, and those sounds were there again and again the day after at that same time. It was something like what I call the unique place rhythms that. But then there were things like also there was this particular group of elderly people. I think there was possibly an elderly home. I think there was an elderly home close to Fitzroy Square, which always, every single day, came into the square at 10 o'clock, around 10, it would stay until 10, 11, and would sit always in the same bench, although there were like, I think 3 or 4 benches, but they always chose that middle one, and then later comes that friend. So those kind of really unique, and then around from 3 to 5 o'clock, there were children in the square because there was an YMCA with, adult researchers living there, and families bring their children out. But then there were also other things, such as that was quite striking. It struck me on the significance of the entrances to the square and the service points of the square. And I'm talking, for example, about a taxi rank. So actually, there were in one of the corners, which was the southeast corner of the square, the taxis would actually come in and stop regularly. So the square is full of is a mixed use, a variety of institutions, including embassies and the international school. So there was this relationship of a more frequent arrival of taxis, and the noise of the banging of the taxi door, and that sort of continuous, which certainly qualified the square strongly. But also, for example, this rhythmic loud noise, the interface between the buildings and the square meant there was always sort of a loud bang of doors closing quite a lot throughout the day. So that also kind of really characterized that space uniquely. So these kind of things I'm referring to, which isolated would sound quite mundane and not meaningful at all for that square, they actually characterize that square, both in terms of its soundscape, but also in terms of facilitating who's coming in, who's coming out, and obviously then it was really interesting for me to again, I think we are urban designers think we know that there's the rush hour, and then there's two periods of the day, and then there's the lunch hour, but actually each space is quite unique. So discovering those temporal atmospheres and when they happen and what time of the day, and isolate those and tell a completely different story about Fitzroy Square from 10 to 11 and Fitzroy Square from 5 to 8. They are completely different places. So you could write about them completely different. So and I think what that has the potential of bringing so much richness onto our practice and how we look at and respond to urban places by not in a generic sort of assumed manner.
Yes, it is sort of the approach of just accepting you don't know and trying to know and find out. But what you say it is very vivid in the book as I was reading it, because it was very interesting to see, as you say, for example, maybe people who work within Fitzroy Square, they probably have no idea there's a elderly care home in the vicinity, because they would never see these people go out whenever they are actually out. And same as I think you said, there was a church gathering as well on the weekend there. Now
Indeed,
that's
yes,
bizarre.
there was an incredible
You wouldn't know that.
community. Yes, Afro-Caribbean community, which every Sunday around 12 o'clock would come out into the square and really, celebrate being together. And their Sunday, sometimes bringing food with them, exchanging, and that was really unique. No one, you wouldn't.
And I would have never guessed that Fitzroy Square could be seen as a place of religion, let's say. It never struck me.
A place for expression, yeah. And bringing those particular groups together, and I think that's when rhythm analysis and place rhythm analysis really allows you to have such an intricate and sensitive social cultural map of the place over time that you would otherwise not even encounter or guess. You'd probably look at what you say then before, the function of Danny. You were talking about looking at the function and the program of around the square, at the square, and then you would kind of assume things, but if you actually don't know these communities, you wouldn't think that they would come and spill into the square afterwards.
Sure.
Or what, you wouldn't have an insight of what they do, what their practices actually are. So, and of course, oh yes, there's the how the time schedule of these community. So there was a really there was a strong community group. I think the chair, the leader of that community group was actually a producer. So he was very keen to use the green the green space, the central green square, for cultural events in the summer, but also over the year there were things like, also birthday parties, or someone from a resident decided to do their own personal event. And it was really striking how that really changed the mood of the square so strongly. But especially when those events were actually open to everybody else, because usually the square would be, in fact, during 6 months of the year, they would open the square as a public space, and how that completely transformed the way people lived and enjoyed and settled as they came in to the square on a daily basis. It became a completely different place from the other rest of the year.
I think rhythm analysis is obviously a really fascinating method for data collection, and to get these insights, you almost have to do a longitudinal study of maybe a year or more. Certainly the insights you're talking about Fitzroy Square, about what happens during 6 months when it's opened as a public space, and the religious gatherings that happen on Sundays, and these are observations that you can make over a very long period of time, and that are obviously very, very valuable. But I almost see a contradiction perhaps in the world of practice, in that we're so devoted to trying to get as much value in as short a space as possible, that it'd be almost very challenging to say to someone, no, wait, we're going to study this for a year, and then we're going to come back. Then we're going to come back and tell you the insights. And so I guess the question here is there a way of sort of shortening that sort of delay on collecting information and actually giving back really good insights, so that it can actually be applied to practice? Because I think practice has got a lot to learn about, in fact, the way people actually use space versus what the intended use is.
Yeah. So I think the reason why this was such a long, was 1 year study in all the 4 seasons. And for me, it was also it was a research. So I was testing and trying methods of rhythm analysis, and what could work and what wouldn't work. So my ambition at that time wasn't to come up with a design for the square, but to develop a methodology that would allow me to approach rhythmicity and map senses of time and temporality at the square. So, which is not the same ambition and the same of an urban designer on a daily basis. So what I went as far, and I think it's an incredibly valid and strong point that needs further thinking, exploration, and debating. As I think we mentioned earlier when there was one question about practice. But place rhythm analysis is seen as a sort of a toolkit of methods of data collection and representation, which was also quite important, which is something which, how do we represent rhythm, and how do we represent in a way that it can help us take it to the studio and interpret it and respond and inspire us to it. So it's a toolkit. So it's not in any way prescribed, oh, you have to do all of these practices in order to perform rhythm analysis, but rather say, there you are, these are ways in which you can collect rhythmic data and map senses of temporality, if that becomes, and as and when that becomes pertinent in the process of analysis and design. So I don't see it as sort of this is the complete and finite package that needs to be performed, but rather these are ways in which you can approach and you can combine. I think in my toolkit of practices there were maybe 5 or 6 or 7 ways of collecting data that then you could juxtapose and triangulate, but then there were also 5 or 6 and I have the exact number, but methods of representing and expressing it in a visual way or in a time-based way as well, with diagrams. And so I think it certainly is a sort of a toolbox for urban designers to take away and utilize in more or less longer periods of time. And I mean, I've seen colleagues doing it already, and researchers indeed sort of going forward and referring to the work and say, well, I use this and this and this as my way forward, and that's small period of time I could, if that's a help, if that sort of clarifies it a little bit. So the book is not prescribing in any way. This is definitely what you have to do in practice and comprehensively, and otherwise you didn't practice place rhythm analysis. That's not. But these are the practices that will help you capture the rhythms and the rhythmicity of a place. Of course, the more you combine them, the more you practice them and triangulate across the findings, the more intricate and the more comprehensive image you will have of it.
Mm.
Having said that, I think there's a strong point there in which there needs more debating about how to integrate this. Is this about changing the way we practice design, urban design completely, which would mean a full revolution of methodologies and various many different questions to efficient time and money and so on. Or is this a sort of a complementary kind of practice that can certainly enrich the practice of urban design? And I tend to see more the latter. I tend to think about it more as the latter. And potentially a unique field of research and practice that can develop side by side and feed into design, urban design practice, and the other way around. So the temporal urban designer and then the planner and the urban designer sort of gaining from each other. That's still something that is evolving and that is worth thinking of. Thank you for bringing me that question.
It's a very interesting way of thinking, because in a way it's somewhat related to being sustainable with finite resources, but here you just assume your finite resources are time and space, so you do about with them what you can and try and utilize them. I suppose the methods could be scaled up or down depending on what you're trying to find in this sort of way. Now, just to finalize this segment, because I think we've poked into it quite a bit, you obviously now know Fitzroy Square through and through, probably better than anyone. Is
like
there
home.
hopefully for the better, and is there anything you would change, or are there any rhythms that you would actually like to enhance? You felt that they were a bit more contained, or some that you would like to tone down because you felt they were overpowering the more, let's say, beneficial or calming, I guess, characteristics of the place?
Probably enhance much of the much loved community practices, such as children playing, elderly meeting and chatting, and respond to how to diffuse moments of overcrowding that happen in the square as well. For example, at lunch hour, but also it's a famous historical square. where flocks, people flock in groups, tourist groups, and they sort of have guided tours into it. So that I think these would be some things that I would actually look at. But also, for example, others would be wanting to diffuse some unwanted sort of antisocial behavior. That there was a moment in that square from 5 in the winter, when it gets really dark around 3:34, where regularly groups of young adults enter the square and use that square as sort of their meeting space, which is great. But then there's issues relating with drug or antisocial behavior that regularly happen in the square as well. So I learned all about those practices that I think would potentially be the focus of design responses. And I think each place would have its unique focus. So we would need to be thought through carefully and specifically designed to target those different each of these ambitions differently.
That's very nice. Yeah, maybe we could use the idea of the communal gardening, Danny, to get the youngsters of Fitzroy Square to engage in more productive behaviors. But yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you.
So, having studied architecture in both Porto and Delft, and having pursued a degree in classical music in Arnhem, this is a really fascinating background that I don't think a lot of professionals or academics would actually take. And I think we were very curious when we were sort of doing our research on you. How was it a passion for music that led to architecture, or was it a passion for architecture that led to music? And is there an obvious leap from one to the other, or were they both kind of like simultaneously fascinating you at the same time, and you just couldn't decide which one you were?
The latter, actually.
Okay.
So I think the passion for music and architecture sort of evolved hand in hand, in somewhat, though music started much earlier. So I had, I started doing music, I was 3 years old, so I don't actually remember. So I think music was just part of my life, just a practice I just did every day, and I enjoyed doing it. It was just naturally as anything I would else do. Go to school, be with my friends, be with sounds, and practice an instrument. So there was something really just quite just unconscious, sort of natural about it. Architecture, I decided I'd study architecture when I was 12, funny enough. So there was something that somewhat, I think I was someone that would just grab a passion and pursue it, and I think that sort of made me continue both hand in hand until university. So I have 2 first degrees. So when I was studying in Delft, I was also studying at university music, and it was not a struggle to me. It was actually a struggle for my teachers to understand at their level. So the institutions I was in Artex University in music was asking me after each exam I had, so when are you going to choose one or the other? And I didn't quite think that was quite fair, because I never thought about choosing. So they were kind of imposing something which is more coming from the outside. Societally, there was no student at university which would be studying architecture or another degree. But for me, it just grew intricately together throughout my life. So I think the only time, I finished my degree in architecture. The only time I stopped the other degree was 6 months before my final dissertation in the architecture, so I froze my my registration in the University of Music, and then went back once I finished architecture to complete the degree for one more year, and then decided to go and do urban design because that's what I really. But I did have a part-time in an urban design consultancy by then already. So, but then decided I'll go back. So I just took it as it came. So they kind of evolved hand in hand. It was nothing I've sort of ever felt. I was put under a lot of pressure at that when you're at the graduate level and postgraduate level to choose, but I kind of resisted that until I graduated and thought, I'll see where life takes me, and end up not doing architecture or not doing music professionally, and going into academia, which is.
And does music still play sort of a very significant role in your life? And do you find that it has a sort of positive impact on your sort of professional sort of lecturing and academic?
Absolutely. I mean, I love the worlds of as you see from my work, the music aesthetics, musicology, performing. I mean, my degree was in performance. I play actively with a professional pianist and a friend, and another cellist, which also studied at very high level. We play together. We love that. My children play. They are. My 15-year-old is almost a cellist professional at the Royal Academy. So it's like it never sort of left my life, and but it certainly, I think what I wanted to say, certainly entered my work and my research in a very even without noticing. So this, I have a passion on a certain type of aesthetics, and I understand. I look at places, performances. I love to look at what people do, how often they do it, and what's meaningful for them, and that sort of was embedded in me as a very natural way of looking at things and thinking about the world and realities and the urban environment out there. So as research progressed, my interest on the sense of time and experience, sort of that world seemed like a very natural world to enter and learn from, and bring, in order to innovate and try and bring new ways of looking at and defining the practice in our discipline.
So following on from that question about the duality of your career with music and academia, if you could design a public space in the image of a classical music piece, well, we realize that for us this question is quite out there, but maybe someone like yourself might be able to answer this. Which piece of classical music would you choose to translate into elements in the physical environment, if you could?
So I think this is a really nice question to explore. So I'm assuming, and in a sense, temporal urban design is set in this frame of mind. So I'm assuming I'm not going to design a completely new space out of the blue. So I'm instead curating this space. I think temporal urban design and place rhythm analysis is a lot about looking at places for curatorship. So curating the city, coming forward with regenerative approaches to design rather than thinking it completely in different in a modernist way. So I think each place would deserve its own piece from that perspective, right? So I wouldn't have a model classical piece to apply into my practice. But for example, I mean, a historical square, I might potentially choose a Baroque piece. given the way its aesthetics, it's all about the sort of juxtaposition of patterns, and in a Baroque sort of a Bach prelude, for example, it's all about juxtaposition of patterns that harmonize or change or give us a sense of surprise and accent at some point in the piece, as well as, for example, in a more historical, coherent piece of architecture. So I'd look at a movement of well-tempered clavier, or I don't know. But for example, if it would be a more eclectic square, meaning bringing different architectural styles and different groups of people, both culturally and intergenerational, then I'd possibly choose a work of Schoenberg or Ligeti, which is more about they're more complex in juxtaposition of sounds that may or may not relate, that can disrupt as a way of producing a different kind of aesthetic. So but then if nature is dominating, then I could look at the work of Ravel or Debussy, which is more impressionist, where there's the impressionists in music. So I think there's and I think this is an interesting conversation to have, because it's the relationship between styles and different forms of art and performative art, and how that analogy also relates to different periods and styles of the architecture of the city and the way we design it. So I think I would try and make that link. But then there's certainly one which is really worth referring to in a way where I would look for reference and inspiration in music, which is the work of Pierre Schaeffer, which is, he founded a movement called Musique Concrète, where sounds of the city are integrated in musical pieces and the other way around. And from there, a big movement has started in sort of 60s, 70s. And it's still a source of inspiration to many musicians, but I think it's also really could be a really interesting source of inspiration for, soundscapers or, looking at rhythmic diversity.
That's fascinating.
That's more the classical one.
So in a completely subjective and personal view, what is your favorite city and why?
So my short answer is I don't have a favorite city. It's true. I don't have a favorite city. Instead, I have cities I hold dear in my heart because of personal experiences and because something special happened in my life whilst I was living in the city or whilst I was visiting in that city. That's it. I thank you for making that question. Actually, no one ever done that question before, and I think if it would be maybe 20 years ago, I would definitely have a quick answer. I love that city. I live that city. But I don't actually. I think I grew into a state that every place and every city has something really unique to look at. And it is not, and I think it's also, I think I really dwell, and I think about cities in the aesthetics I'm talking about in cities, and beauty in cities for me doesn't mean that a particularly subjective sense of style or a kind of a favorite period of architectural period I favor, and I think this realization came to me. I mean, I visited completely contrasting cities, such as, and recently the city of Beirut, for example, not as recent, maybe a couple of years ago, But as I was in the city, I absolutely love that city, but not from the same reasons I would love Paris or I would love Amsterdam or I would love London. So therefore, I don't have a favorite city.
Only favorite places, maybe.
Yeah, which are then associated. I think I have potentially favorite experiences, favorite urban experiences, more than a favorite location.
That's so
That's a really
interesting.
interesting way of sort of reframing that question. Is
Yeah.
that it's not like the whole, but it's
No.
moments and
Especially if
Well,
you've
it's
lived
about what
somewhere.
happened in that
Yes.
particular urban environment that struck to me, rather than the setting.
Physical, going back to temporality and how
Yes.
important it is for your memory and for how you perceive the city.
And
You won't remember the buildings, you remember the experiences.
whether you go back to it or you know, and if you, yeah.
So on a completely sort of personal note,
Yeah.
we've just talked about music, and obviously how it was a degree in classical music you did, wasn't it?
Yes, and
Um,
yeah, both teaching and performing. Yeah.
And is that the genre you enjoy listening to most, or are there other genres that you catch yourself listening to lots as well?
So I enjoy listening a lot of classical music, not least, having two girls that play classical music, and I like playing as well. And I think but I do have I do have a bit of an eclectic taste and mix, so I do listen to different styles of music. But I think it's worth mentioning here that I have one of my hobbies, one of my passions, is something I really enjoy to do, is to listen to a piece of classical music, and look at the conductor's scores at the same time. That's a little bit of sort of a something I enjoy doing, and I think that tells a bit about how I like listening to places as well. So when I listen to a piece of say a symphony, I listen every time I listen that piece, I listen to and I see it in the score, different instruments and different rhythmic and melodic lines. So for me, it's always and then listening again is always a totally different sound and rhythmic experience. So it's always like a journey. So I do have a very unique way of experiencing classical music or and which I enjoy, and it's not necessarily everyone's way of doing it. I've had many debates, many conversations with members of my family, and they get a bit startled of the way if I look at it, and it's really nice to see how they look at it. I mean, other people love listening to classical music and associating it with colors and landscapes, and so there's many different ways. So I really enjoy that, searching from that diversity of sounds and melodies that juxtapose, and the next day I listen to it and it's a completely different experience and I discover different things. So it's a really pleasure for me, and listening to things like a piece of Debussy, La Mer, and just looking through what he wrote at the same time. But then I love jazz. I love jazz classics. I just love it. It's just the natural home to me. Ella Fitzgerald's Autumn in New York, and Keith Jarrett, Charlie Parker and Summertime, those lovely classics, but Louis Armstrong. But in jazz I also love experimental jazz, so say improvisation. So and that's something I'd love doing as a practice with a friend of mine when I was studying at the conservatoire. We would meet once a week for an hour, and then we would just sit, and he played the clarinet, I played the flute, and we just for an hour we would just improvise and create new melodies and do so again, it's not the sort of the maybe what everyone likes to do, but that's something. And so I love listening to jazz and improvisation, going to a jazz gig, and I think it's an incredible experience, and see what people come up with as they do it. Which again, you could build an analogy how I look at spaces and just go with an open minded and just see what's beautiful about what people are doing today and how different they did it from the day before. I find that absolutely fascinating. So I have a Portuguese duo, which is Mário Lajinha and Maria João, which I always loved throughout my teenagehood, and they're still playing, and singing. But then I love world music. I love like Pink Martini. I'm not sure you know that. So Pink Martini is a group which they reinterpret songs and pop, rock, and different ones from different geographies. So Japan, or so famous songs, American or European, or more of French or English or Scottish. And then so, and I mean, the last thing is I think there's one I don't hear so often, which is fado, which fado is a soul style of music, a Portuguese one, which it kind of always brings me home somewhat when I do hear it. It's very nostalgic experience, so maybe that's why I don't go back to it too much. But I mean, that's me kind of. I mean, I could go on. I love acoustic guitar and really strong voices. You know, Adele, Tracy Chapman. I just anyone with a very strong voice. I love it. I love to hear.
It's remarkable how actually we're going to these sort of more personal questions, and actually they're kind of laying out the foundations for rhythm analysis and
exactly,
tempo places.
Yes.
Okay,
it is really starting to make sense. Yes, your personality and the way you approach architecture and urban design is just so well connected.
It's really fantastic.
It makes a lot of sense.
Oh, does it? Okay. Again, another nice question. Thanks for doing that. Never really. I think another question, part of the questions was it changed over the years?
Yes.
And I think it certainly did. I think one thing that it changed is I think I'm more eclectic, so I listen more different styles, and I'm quite open to it. As long as I think obviously my training as a musician does mean that I might be quite critical about the quality of voice or the quality of the tune or the quality. But what's nice is that I think I'm more clear now what I like and what I don't like, which is not necessarily good or positive, but because it kind of just I brush away things quite quickly. But I love discovering new music as well. So.
Yeah. Well, it would make sense that from the technical point of view, you would experience music differently. But it's still very encouraging to hear that you still give it an open mind regardless.
I love absolutely listening to new music and, new styles, and just really, see what is it that the other one wants to give.
I feel like urbanism can learn a lot from music in terms of identity, because as you said, there is a certain genre of music that relates to specific Portuguese type of music making.
Yeah, that strikes home, or just brings you to places, and there's a whole there's something really strong about the way you relate to music and places at the same time that it's really worth thinking about.
And then I saw sort of a lasting question for maybe our younger audience, or those that are sort of just at the stage ahead of us who are looking out to the world of academia and practice. What's the advice that you'd give yourself at your younger self, that is at the very beginning of your career, or that you'd give to someone like us who's in this position, looking forward up to this mountain of experiences that we've yet to reach?
I feel like we've just covered it. I was going to say, find your passion and pursue it. It will sustain you through hardship, and you're more likely to come into or get to that extraordinary place where you find it personally rewarding, but also have a social impact. I think that would be my recommendation. Certainly what I try to say to my own students.
Wonderful.
That's lovely. So Wunderlich, as we are approaching the end of this episode, now is the moment to ask, what's new for you? And are there any upcoming projects, books, or events we should be looking out for?
So currently I'm working on different projects. One I perhaps could mention, and it evolves naturally out of this book, which is to expand on that last chapter, which talks about practice. So how do we then practice for the sense of time, for rhythm, and something I'm really passionate to develop. So I'm looking into taking those principles that I bring forward for practice as a basis and bring forward illustrations of how and what that looks for, to then also to feed into a more direct dialogue with professionals and understand what does this approach then means to actually urban design practice, and where do we go from now. And very nicely, I think you've touched upon it in some of the questions, and we've explored bits of it. That's one big project that kind of spans out of this book. There are other projects which are running in parallel, but I think this is kind of the most significant to mention.
I see. And since you're also leading the interdisciplinary master's course at the Bartlett, are you also testing or experimenting with these as you go, also with your students? Do you involve them in such? And
Absolutely.
wonderful.
So I don't strictly have a course that is dedicated to temporal urban design or place rhythm analysis, at least not yet. But I do offer my students lectures on the topic, particularly one big lecture now on in term 2 as part of a course I coordinate on cities and design methodology. So a place temporal urban design approach and place rhythm analysis in particular is part of that course. And it's really rewarding to see then my MRes students going off and using that practice in their research, which I have the pleasure to coach. There was one particular student last year, but then a couple more PhD students which are really interested in the topic and want to apply it in the context of, for example, heritage, in Thai urbanism, and a different view on it, and others. So it's really. So again, there's not a comprehensive course at the moment, but there might be one in the future.
Yes, and I would strongly encourage anyone listening to read Dr. Wunderlich's insightful book, Temporal Urban Design, Temporality, Rhythm, and Place. I know for me it was very insightful in terms of my research, but also in personal life. We have a small garden right in front of our office window. And ever since I read your book, I've been looking at it every time we have lunch. It's so fascinating. There's not a single similar lunchtime that happens in this small garden, because depending on the time of the year, it could be graduation time. So there'll be a lot of people in robes taking pictures with family. Or if it's during early autumn time or early springtime, people will be just more lingering. But then during summer, there's almost no one, and just people napping on the ground. It's just very fascinating. It's a way where you never really experience places until someone kind of tells you about it, and you're like, wow. So I really honestly recommend this book to anyone who's interested in the city, who's interested in looking at the city, not even from the professional point of view, but from a holistic point of view, from a new, almost a philosophy of looking at city, if it could be championed this way. Obviously stepping on huge giants, but as all research is.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment.
Anyways, this has been very lovely and insightful, and we thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. So we really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for giving us your time, and we very much look forward to having another episode together in the near future. Thank you so much, Dr. Wunderlich.
I'll be very happy to come back. Yeah.
Cheers.
That's great. Thank you so much.
That's all from us. A massive thank you to our guest, Professor Filipa Wunderlich, for sharing her invaluable insights on temporal urban design. We want to take a moment to thank Strath Union for housing us in their media suite, our department, the Department of Architecture, and our coordinator, Umbretta, for all their support. Finally, we want to thank you, our listeners, for always engaging with the content we publish. Once again, we've been the PGR Podcast. I've been Danny Dunn, hosting with Katrine Japanova. Finally, one thank you to our colleague Carolina Rigoni for her contributions in creating this episode. As always, stay safe, stay informed, and stay curious.